April's usual sort of flurry of financial changes gives the government a rare bundle of good news stories to tie up with a bit of an Easter ribbon. Let's go through them. The Prime Minister will undoubtedly spend this week highlighting the minimum wage increase, also a fall in energy bills and that national insurance cut. But unfortunately, as I'm sure you well know, April also brings misery for millions. Council tax rises, broadband, your mobile phone bill, water charges. We're all going to have yikes with all of those. And that is clearly going to be a blow to many of us juggling finances in the cost of living crisis. To make matters worse for the Conservatives, a new poll offers very little hope that Rishi Sunak can actually resurrect his party's electoral fortunes. Seat-by-seat analysis published yesterday shows Tory prospects have hit a record low. They are on track for their worst ever election result, winning fewer than 100 seats. Let's look at how the Conservatives could shift the dial. Joining me in the studio is Chief Political Commentator at The Independent, John Rentoul, and also the former Conservative advisor, Charlie Rowley. We're also joined down the line by political commentator Mike Indian. Mike, let's start with you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This change in minimum wage, how significant is it? I think it's about 2.7 million people who have their pay packets boosted by it, but by how much?
So we're seeing about a 10% rise here. It's going to the national living wage, which is paid to the over 21s from this April, is going to £11.44p an hour. That crucially meets the government's two-thirds of median income target. And also they've published the remit last week as well for the Low Pay Commission, mandating them when they make their recommendations for next year to try and maintain that target as well. Now, governments love the minimum wage as a policy because A, it gives them a headline-grabbing cost of living relief answer, but also it's a great way of indirectly increasing taxation without actually having to spend any public money on it either.
I think the people receiving that sort of extra £1 an hour it will be, though, will also be looking at their council tax, their water bills. Mike, from your perspective, looking at what people have got coming in and going out, are people actually going to feel better off?
I don't think so. And we must be reminded that we're still in the middle of the biggest cost of living squeeze since records began in the 1950s. Real disposable household income is falling for 2 years consecutively. And this is one of the reasons why Rishi Sunak has been keen to get inflation down, but he hasn't been able to ease the squeeze on people's pay packets, on people's pockets, not just on low incomes, but on many middle-income earners as well.
Mike, hold right there in the studio. John, Charlie. John, what do you make of that analysis that, you know, the Conservatives will be, I'm sure, and they have already been doing it this morning and will continue it this week, say, you know, good news, we're looking at your pay packets, the economy's on track. Do you think that's actually cutting through that message?
No, because as was just said, you know, if you look at the overall picture, people are still feeling the squeeze. People may be gaining in one respect, but they're losing in another. And what people always say is, you know, the government takes with one hand, gives us another, and they feel worse off. And the one thing you haven't mentioned is people coming off fixed interest rate mortgages.
Of course, yeah.
There's, you know, I mean that's a fairly small group of people, but it's a tranche each month, you know, coming off.
And it's not insignificant for them at all.
And for them, it could be
pretty
a
crippling.
really nasty shock. Yeah.
Charlie, this all paints a picture where people feel like, you know, I thought I could trust the Conservatives with the economy, and I feel like I can't.
Well, things take a bit of time to bed in, and you know those polls for some time have been against the Tories. But you know, you listed a great shopping list of good news there for the Tories. And for
Remind us of the positives on the shopping list.
Well, a living wage, a national living wage increases for millions of people. You're seeing inflation coming down. You're seeing many more people in work than ever before. The economy is picking up. You know, it is starting to grow. But it does take time. I mean, Rishi's been talking for a long time about getting inflation down. It was at 10-11% when he first became Prime Minister. Now, of course, that was on the back of a pretty shoddy budget under his predecessor, which didn't go down so well with the markets, which led to some of the things that John was just talking about with those mortgage rates. So I think things take time, but there is a good set of news.
You haven't got much time, Charlie. You've only got 9 months.
And that's why, well, exactly. And that's why I think the election will be in the later half, still the working assumption at the later half of the year in October, November, than perhaps in June, as some people are predicting.
Yes, what we would expect with time, Charlie, is that the polls narrow and maybe the difference between the two parties gets a little bit closer. John, this poll published in the Sunday Times yesterday, I mean, it had the Conservatives with just 98 seats.
Yeah, I mean, it dramatised what we already know. Actually, I mean, if you go into the detail of it, I'm not convinced that the SNP is going to win 41 seats, or that the Lib Dems are going to win as few as 22. So I would argue with I'd like to look at the actual model and argue with it, but there's no question that if you take the average of the opinion polls at the moment, the Labour lead is 20 points, and that is a disastrous position for a government 9 months away from a general election.
What could change that, Charlie? 9 months, not that long.
It's not long, but the Prime Minister, whatever you think about the policies that the government have put forward, they've got to deliver on them. So, inflation has got to come down. It's already come down significantly. It's got to come down further by about 2%, I think the Bank of England suggested in a couple of months' time. The Rwanda policy has got to get off the ground, pardon the pun. That's something the government's said it's going to do. It's got to deliver on that, otherwise it shoots its credibility to pieces. The economy's got to grow. You've got to see those waiting lists coming down in the NHS, and we're starting to see some of that. Victoria Atkins, I think last week or a few days ago, was talking about bringing in more of the private sector, so moving people that are on those long waiting lists who've been on waiting lists for 18 months or more are now going to be treated in the private sector rather than in the NHS. So that will help with waiting lists. But there has to be more good news stories. There's got to be more policies on things like housing, things an offer to young people, which we don't have at the minute. But Labour also don't have policies that I think the public know about enough, and arguably they might not have had to put anything forward because of the internal warfare within the Tory party. But when it comes to that election, when the public's minds are focused enough on it, I think there'll be a very clear choice between Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer.
The thing is, the Prime Minister did make it very clear about what he was going to do. Mike's still with us. Mike, two of those pledges was I'm going to cut waiting lists in the NHS. I'm also going to stop the boats. What we're seeing today, and we're going to get into this in quite a bit more detail, long waits in accident and emergency in England, it's estimated that is killing about 250 people a week. We're also seeing a record number of people who illegally cross the channel at this time of the year, already 5,000. When we look at those promises that the Prime Minister said, look, I'm going to deliver on these, they're starting to fall apart somewhat.
The waiting list target the Prime Minister has been rowing back on for quite some time, and we also have to remember as well that if we look at his main targets around growth too, one of the key reasons that we're seeing falling GDP per head in this country is that we have record numbers of people who are economically inactive due to long-term sickness as well. And all this is going to feed into a narrative ahead of the local elections, I think, Rosie, where the Prime Minister is heading, for a high watermark defence from Boris Johnson's results 3 years ago, and on the wake of the sort of vaccine boom too. So he'd automatically be on the defensive too. But with that 20-point poll lead, if Labour makes substantial gains, he's then got to deal with potentially dozens of more conservative MPs deciding to retire, as we saw with Labour in 2010, the last time there was actually a genuine chance of there being a change in government at an election. So again, I question whether even if he did hit these targets, I still think it's going to come down to the fact, do people feel better off than they did 14 years ago or even 5 years ago? Because there's huge chunks of that 2019 manifesto, like the 14 new hospitals, like migration, like the post-Brexit settlement, they just haven't delivered for people. Now, part of that's been to do with the internal politics of the Conservative Party, part to do with the pandemic, but the Prime Minister was right, I think, to make clear commitments to the electorate. But conversely, if you don't hit those targets, people start to wonder what you can actually do, even if you do manage to hang on to power.
Yeah, and you do wonder, actually, those in power, the rest of the Conservative Party, I think it's 63 Conservative MPs now who've said they're not going to stand for re-election. John, does that suggest that the party's lost confidence?
It does rather, although, as Mike just said, it's not as many Labour MPs as announced that they were standing down before the 2010 election, but there's still time.
There's a long time to go, yeah.
The 9 months. But I think, the bottom line is that Rishi Sunak hopes that people will notice the tax cut that takes effect today. Is it to actually take effect today? I don't know. But anyway,
that's as the national living wage changes today.
No, the national insurance cut.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Is 2p in the pound off national insurance. That's quite a big chunk. And there was a previous tax cut that came into effect in January.
But I think people largely didn't notice that the first time that happened, December, January.
Yeah. But he's going to have another fiscal event, another mini budget before the election campaign, and he'll offer more tax cuts then, and he's hoping that people will think that they're not going to get these kind of tax cuts under a Labour government. But if you just think back to previous occasions where prime ministers have gone to the last possible date in the hope that something will turn up. Things have only got worse for them. You know, James Callaghan in 1978 and John Major in 1996.
What could get worse for the Conservatives is a boom in support for reform. Charlie, how do you think the Conservatives are going to try and stave off hemorrhaging votes to people who say, actually, you're not delivering, but I am actually hearing from these other people who have promised to do that and more?
Well, I think it's just got to be very, very clear in the comms that, look, you know, people voted for the Conservatives in 2019. They voted for Boris Johnson, but they voted for the Conservative Party because they didn't want to vote for Labour because Labour had left those communities behind. So if you vote for reform in the Red Wall area in particular, then that is basically a vote for the Labour Party that that deserted you 4 or 5 years ago. So don't put that at risk. And if you voted for Brexit, particularly in the northern constituencies, a vote for Labour could take you back into, or certainly closer ties with the EU, something that people voted to leave. So there is a real risk of voting reform on policy fronts, but also on political fronts, because reform are not going to have any really MPs. They might get quite a big chunk of vote across the country, but they're not going to translate that into seats. And so the choice is either going to be Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister that's still dealing things with like Rwanda, with the economy, versus Sir Keir Starmer, who people still, despite all of the internal warfare within the Conservative Party, which I think has not been its greatest hour, to say the least, I still think people are still not sure or convinced about Sir Keir Starmer as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
You're nodding, John.
No, well, they don't like Keir Starmer very much, but they really don't like Rishi Sunak. I mean, which is a terrible shame, because I think he's a decent, hard-working, honest centrist of the kind of person who ought to be Prime Minister of this country. But his party has become ungovernable, and he's just taken over at the wrong time. And I think
ungovernable. Do you think?
Well, I mean, it just reminds me of John Major in the run-up to the '97 election. John Major was begging his MPs not to cause trouble over Europe, not to bind his hands on the issue of the single currency. How quaint that seems now. But it was the same lack of discipline. I mean, you just had Tory MPs thinking that their hour of glory had come, and they would go on television and slag off the party leader and the Prime Minister. And that's the sort of thing which is utterly disastrous for a government.
Yeah. Mike, the Labour Party right now are just effectively holding steady, holding still, trying not to make a mistake. And that strategy may serve them very well.
I think it will to a point, but I think, like a lot of change elections, and we saw this, one of the key reasons I think why David Cameron didn't win an overall majority in 2010 was the fact that he wasn't able to bring enough of the country convincingly behind him. And of course, one of the biggest switches we see from 2019 Conservative voters isn't to Reform or to Labour, it's actually to not voting at all. And then those key marginal seats, that could cost Labour. They still have to gain 120 odd seats to even get a majority of one inside the House of Commons as well. We have seen consistent these multi-regressional polling analysis showing that Labour could win a 200-seat majority. If Keir Starmer gets a majority of one, he is, at a mounted decline that was, more so than Attlee, Wilson, or Blair in that space as well. But what I'd hope to see is close to the election that we'll see more of that, of not only just who Keir Starmer is, but also what his governing philosophy will be, but also tangible examples of how he's going to try and make the country better, people feel better, just like New Labour did in 1997. It doesn't have to be flashy, but I think the Prime Minister had the right idea with those clear pledges, but it has to be something that Keir Starmer is sure he could achieve when he's in power.
Quite difficult, though, to actually do that, John. I mean, as soon as the Labour Party announced something, the Conservatives come up with their next fiscal mini-event or whatever it is and scupper their strategy. So, they've got to hold their cards fairly close to their chest.
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, the Labour Party is desperate not to do anything, not to move, for fear of dropping their huge opinion poll lead. I mean, it is it's a very difficult position for them. I think their strategy is absolutely the right one, because if they start promising things, people will say, well, how are you going to pay for it? And their economic inheritance is going to be absolutely dreadful. So they don't want people to focus on that. They just want people to focus on how much they don't like the Conservatives.
Because the reality is, Charlie, if the polls are to be believed, if we end up with Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, how much is he really going to be able to do that differently to what Rishi Sunak's trying to do now? As we've heard now from Keir Starmer, words echoing the Conservatives, there's no magic money tree.
Well, that's absolutely right. And look, the discipline is going to be key on both sides, because the longer you wait until election, the more tension that mounts within the Labour Party, because there'll be more pressure to announce things. There'll be more pressure to set out their spending commitments, whether they committed to the childcare policies that the government announced, whether taxes would go up or not. The pressure cooker within the Labour Party and within the leadership of the Labour Party will only continue to grow. And when you do get closer to an election, the polls will start to narrow. So no wonder the Labour Party...
They might.
well, no wonder the Labour
hearing that, they're going further apart.
Well, the Labour Party, no wonder they'll want an election sooner rather than later, because they'll be aware of that. But just on the polls, funny enough, I mean, look, I think it's fair to say I've not been around as long as John or many other.
They all me,
or many others. But I just go back to 2010 when as Mike was just saying, David Cameron was supposed to win an overall majority and ended up in a coalition. In 2015,
David Cameron was not 20 points ahead in 2010.
Ed Miliband in 2015 was supposed to become the next Prime Minister, and
he wasn't 20 points ahead
majority.
either. But Tony Blair was 20 points ahead and ended up not being 20 points ahead on the day.
But the point that I'm making,
some consolation.
But in 2016, just throughout history over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, the polls haven't always ended up where they're suspected. Theresa May was 20 points ahead in the polls in 2017, didn't work out for her, and you could have had Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. So I just think for now, when the public are not switched on by politics, there's been far too much of it. There's been far too much internal party politics within the Conservative Party, obviously dominating the headlines and the noises off with reform and all the rest of it. But I think when push comes to shove and when the public have got to make a choice, they really will focus on who is the best party to govern this country. And there'll have to be very clear choices, very clear policies for the public to vote on.
Yeah, final word to you there, Mike. I think what Charlie just said there, the public aren't sort of really immediately captivated by this. They're probably just feeling a bit fed up. And maybe actually, turnout could be a problem come the election, because people feel... Actually, the real differences between these two parties, I can't hugely identify them. And I feel like I kind of know who's going to win, so I'm not hugely invested.
Well, I mean, we saw this in 2001 with the second Blair landslide. Turnout fell to about 55%, down from sort of 70-ish at the previous election. It's interesting because with a change election, turnout does tend to increase. People do send some things in there. But of course, we're sort of, 15 years on from sort of the last change election, and people are more anti-politics than they ever have been before. And yet, in the words of Blair, politics is still the arena where great things can happen. They can still transform people's lives. And this is where I think, yes, Labour are right not to say anything now. But as we get into the short campaign, there needs to be something in that manifesto that's really going to grab people's attention. Now, I think 5 years of competent, steady government after the chaos of the last, 3 Tory prime ministers that we've seen is probably not necessarily a bad thing. But there still needs to be something to get people out and give them just a little bit of hope, Rosie.
I'm sure. Mike, thank you so much. John, Charlie in the studio as well. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for spending some of your Easter bank holiday weekend with me in for Vanessa.